Imagine this, a quiet, dimly lit street in a small American town where the hum of life has faded into the night. An elderly man, frail but dignified, walks slowly, his footsteps echoing against the silence. He's just another face in the crowd, a man who's lived a life of quiet resilience, unnoticed by the world. But tonight, his life is about to collide with a force of unimaginable consequence. As he turns the corner, three shadowy figures emerge from the darkness, their faces masked by hoods, their intentions clear. They surround him, their voices dripping with menace, demanding his wallet, his watch, his dignity. The man, trembling but defiant, hands over his belongings, his eyes burning with a quiet fury. What these thugs don't know what they couldn't possibly know is that this man is no ordinary victim. His son, a man of immense power and authority, commands an army. And when he finds out what's happened to his father, the consequences will be swift, brutal, and utterly unforgettable. This is not just a story about crime and retribution. It's a story about the bonds of family, the weight of power, and the explosive collision of two worlds that were never meant to meet. It's a story that will make you question the limits of justice, the price of loyalty, and the lengths to which a son will go to protect his father. And by the end of this video, you'll have the answers to the questions burning in your mind. Who are these thugs, and what drives their hate? Who is this elderly man, and why does his son's power make him a target? And most importantly, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Let me tell you something right here, right now. You're not just watching a story unfold. You're stepping into a world where every decision has a consequence, where every action ripples outward, changing lives forever. This is a story that will grip you from the very first second and refuse to let go. And I promise you this, by the time we reach the end, you'll be left breathless, your heart racing, your mind spinning with questions. But here's the thing, you're not going to get all the answers right away. This is a journey, and like any great journey, it's filled with twists, turns, and moments that will leave you on the edge of your seat. So, who is this elderly man? At first glance, he's just another retiree, a man who spent his life working hard, raising a family, and living quietly. But beneath that unassuming exterior lies a man of deep strength and quiet wisdom. He's a father who's sacrificed everything for his son, a man who's seen the best and worst of humanity. And then there's his son, a man who's risen to the highest echelons of power, commanding an army with a reputation for precision, discipline, and, when necessary, overwhelming force. He's a man who's spent his life building a legacy, only to find that legacy threatened by the actions of a few reckless individuals. But let's not forget the thugs, the catalysts of this story. They're not just faceless criminals. They're young men driven by desperation, anger, and a sense of entitlement. They see the elderly man as an easy target, a way to make a quick buck. But in their arrogance, they've underestimated the power of family, the strength of a father's love, and the fury of a son's wrath. They've set in motion a chain of events that will change their lives forever, and not in the way they expected. As we dive deeper into this story, you'll find yourself asking questions you never thought to ask. What drives someone to commit such a heinous act? What kind of man commands an army, and how does that power shape his decisions? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to seek justice in a world where the lines between right and wrong are often blurred? These are the questions that will keep you hooked, the questions that will force you to keep watching until the very end. But here's the thing, this isn't just a story about revenge. It's a story about redemption, about the power of forgiveness, and about the lengths we'll go to protect the ones we love. It's a story that will challenge your assumptions, make you question your beliefs, and leave you thinking long after the video ends. And that's why you're here, not just to be entertained, but to be moved, to be challenged, to be changed. So, as we begin this journey together, I want you to do something for me. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of these characters. Imagine what it's like to be that elderly man, facing down his attackers with nothing but his dignity. Imagine what it's like to be his son, hearing the news and feeling the weight of his power and responsibility. And yes, Imagine what it's like to be one of those thugs, realizing too late that they've made a mistake they can never take back. Because that's what great stories do, they make us see the world through someone else's eyes, if only for a moment. And now, as we stand on the precipice of this tale, I leave you with this: the thugs think they've gotten away with it. They think they've taken what they wanted and left without a trace. But they're wrong. Dead wrong. Because even as they disappear into the night, a storm is brewing, a storm that will shake their world to its core. And when it hits, there will be no escape. So what happens next? You'll have to keep watching to find out. But I'll tell you this, the answer is closer than you think, and it's more shocking than you can imagine. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. The night of the mugging was just the beginning, a spark that ignited a firestorm none of the thugs could have foreseen. The elderly man, whose name was Harold, had always been a pillar of quiet strength in his community. A retired schoolteacher, he had spent decades shaping young minds, instilling values of kindness, respect, and integrity. But life had not been easy for Harold. He had buried his wife 5 years earlier, and though his son, Marcus, had risen to become one of the most respected military commanders in the country, their relationship had grown strained over the years. Marcus's demanding career had kept him away from home, and Harold, though proud of his son, often felt the weight of loneliness. That night, as he walked home from the local diner where he'd spent hours chatting with old friends, he never imagined it would be the last moment of peace he'd know for a long time. The thugs, on the other hand, were products of a different world. Jake, the ringleader, was a 22-year-old high school dropout who had grown up in a broken home, his father in prison, and his mother struggling with addiction. His two accomplices, Tyler and Rico, were no better off young men who had fallen through the cracks of a system that had failed them time and time again. They weren't inherently evil, but desperation and a lack of guidance had led them down a dark path. That night, they weren't thinking about the consequences of their actions. They weren't thinking about the man they were robbing or the life he had lived. All they saw was an opportunity, a chance to get ahead in a world that had always pushed them down. But in their haste, they had made a fatal mistake, one that would soon come back to haunt them. Meanwhile, miles away, Marcus was in the middle of a high-stakes military operation. As the commander of an elite Special Forces unit, he was used to making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But even as he focused on the mission at hand, his mind often drifted to his father. They hadn't spoken in months, not since their last argument about Marcus's relentless dedication to his career. Harold had begged him to slow down, to take a step back and focus on family, but Marcus had brushed him off, insisting that his work was too important. Now, as he received the news of the mugging, a cold fury settled over him. His father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about honor and resilience, had been attacked by cowards who didn't know the meaning of either. And Marcus, with all the power and resources at his disposal, was determined to make them pay. But this story isn't just about Marcus's quest for justice. It's also about the thugs and the lives they led before that fateful night. Jake, for all his bravado, was a young man haunted by regret. He had once dreamed of becoming a mechanic, of building a life for himself and his younger sister, who looked up to him as her only source of stability. But those dreams had been crushed under the weight of poverty and bad decisions. Tyler, the quiet one of the group, had a talent for art that had gone unnoticed and unnurtured. He had turned to crime not out of greed, but out of a desperate need to belong, to feel like he was part of something bigger than himself. Enrico, the youngest at just 19, was a kid who had never known a father's love or a mother's guidance. He had joined Jake and Tyler because they were the closest thing he had to family, even if that family was built on a foundation of crime. As the days passed, the tension began to mount. Harold, though physically unharmed, was deeply shaken by the attack. He tried to brush it off, to tell himself that it was just a random act of violence, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play. He had always been a man of intuition, and now that intuition was telling him that this wasn't over. Meanwhile, Marcus was pulling every string he could to track down the thugs. Using his military connections, he launched a covert investigation, determined to find the men who had dared to hurt his father. But as he dug deeper, he began to uncover a web of secrets and lies that went far beyond a simple mugging. The thugs, it seemed, were connected to a local crime syndicate that had been operating under the radar for years. And that syndicate had ties to powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. At the same time, Jake, Tyler, and Rico were beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake. News of the mugging had spread quickly, and they were starting to feel the heat. Jake, in particular, was growing paranoid, convinced that someone was watching them. He didn't know who Marcus was or what he was capable of, but he could sense that they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Tyler, ever the artist, began sketching portraits of Harold, as if trying to understand the man they had wronged. And Rico, the youngest and most vulnerable, started to question whether this life was really what he wanted. But it was too late for second thoughts. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no turning back. As the story unfolds, we see these lives intertwine in ways none of them could have predicted. Harold, though shaken, begins to find a new sense of purpose. He starts reaching out to young people in his community, offering them the guidance and support he had once given to his students. Marcus, driven by a mix of anger and guilt, becomes consumed by his mission, risking everything to bring the thugs to justice. And the thugs themselves, caught in a web of their own making, begin to unravel, each of them grappling with the choices that led them to this point. But the question remains, what happens when these worlds collide? What happens when a man who commands an army comes face to face with the thugs who attacked his father? And what happens when those thugs, desperate and cornered, decide to fight back? The answers are coming, but not yet. For now, the tension continues to build, the stakes grow higher, and the lines between right and wrong become increasingly blurred. This is a story about power, about family, and about the choices that define us. And it's far from over. The investigation deepened. Marcus began to uncover layers of the crime syndicate that even he hadn't anticipated. What started as a personal mission to avenge his father soon revealed a sprawling network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government and law enforcement. The thugs Jake, Tyler, and Rico were mere pawns in a much larger game, their actions orchestrated by a shadowy figure known only as the Broker. This man, whose real identity was shrouded in mystery, had been pulling strings from behind the scenes for years, using young, desperate men like Jake and his crew to do his dirty work while he reaped the profits. The Broker's operation was a well-oiled machine, designed to exploit the vulnerable and evade detection, and Marcus knew that taking him down would be no small feat. But he also knew that if he didn't act fast, the Broker would disappear, leaving no trace of his crimes and no justice for Harold. Meanwhile, Harold's quiet life had taken an unexpected turn. After the mugging, he had begun receiving anonymous letters, each one more cryptic than the last. At first, he dismissed them as the work of a prankster, but as the messages grew more personal, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to the attack. The letters spoke of secrets long buried, of a past Harold had tried to forget, and of a debt that had come due. They were signed with a single initial B. Harold's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. Who was B and what did they want from him? Was this about the mugging, or was there something darker at play? He thought about confiding in Marcus, but he hesitated. His son was already consumed by his own mission, and Harold didn't want to burden him further. But as the letters continued to arrive, Harold realized that he couldn't face this alone. He would have to confront the past he had tried so hard to leave behind. For Jake, Tyler, and Rico, the pressure was becoming unbearable. The Broker had cut off all contact, leaving them to fend for themselves as the noose tightened around them. Jake, once the confident leader of the group, was now a shadow of his former self, jumping at every sound and seeing enemies where there were none. Tyler, who had always been the quiet thinker, began to suspect that they were being set up. He had overheard a conversation between two of the Broker's enforcers, talking about tying up loose ends, and he knew what that meant. Rico, the youngest and most impressionable, was on the verge of breaking. He had started having nightmares about Harold, seeing the old man's face in his dreams, his eyes filled with a sadness Rico couldn't understand. He wanted out, but he didn't know how to escape the life he had chosen. The three of them were trapped, caught between a ruthless crime boss and a military commander who would stop at nothing to bring them to justice. But just when it seemed like the story couldn't get any more intense, an unexpected twist changed everything. Marcus, in his relentless pursuit of the broker, discovered a connection that sent shockwaves through his investigation. The broker wasn't just a faceless criminal. Mastermind, he was someone Marcus had crossed paths with before. Years ago, during a covert mission overseas, Marcus had been part of a team that took down a human trafficking ring. The operation had been a success, but one of the key players had escaped, vanishing without a trace. That man, Marcus now realized, was the broker. The discovery was a game changer. This wasn't just about Harold anymore, it was about unfinished business, about a mission that had haunted Marcus for years. The stakes had just been raised, and Marcus knew that this was no longer just a personal vendetta, it was a battle for justice on a much larger scale. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, the tension reached a boiling point. Harold, driven by a mix of fear and determination, decided to investigate the letters on his own. He reached out to an old friend, a retired detective named Frank, who had a knack for uncovering the truth. Together, they began to dig into Harold's past, uncovering secrets that had been buried for decades. What they found was shocking. B was someone Harold had known long ago, someone he had trusted, someone who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The revelation left Harold reeling, but it also gave him a newfound sense of purpose. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he was a man with a mission, determined to confront the ghosts of his past and protect the people he loved. Meanwhile, Jake, Tyler, and Rico were running out of time. Marcus was closing in, and the broker's enforcers were closing in too. In a desperate bid for survival, they decided to turn the tables. Using the little information they had about the broker's operation, they hatched a plan to expose him, hoping that by bringing him down, they could buy themselves some leniency. But they underestimated the broker's reach. As they put their plan into motion, they were ambushed, their safe house raided by armed men who left no doubt about their intentions. Jake managed to escape, but Tyler and Rico weren't so lucky. The last thing Jake saw as he fled into the night was Tyler being dragged away, his face a mask of terror, and Rico lying motionless on the ground. It was a moment that would haunt Jake forever, a stark reminder of the cost of the life he had chosen. As the story hurtles toward its climax, the lines between hero and villain blur. Marcus, driven by a mix of duty and vengeance, is forced to confront the moral complexities of his mission. Harold, grappling with the ghosts of his past, must decide how far he's willing to go to protect his family. And Jake, now alone and hunted, must face the consequences of his actions and decide whether he has the courage to change. The stage is set for an explosive confrontation, one that will test the limits of loyalty, justice, and redemption. But the question remains, who will come out on top? The answer is closer than ever, but the journey is far from over. Stay tuned, because the best is yet to come. The final act of this gripping tale begins with Marcus closing in on the broker's lair, a heavily fortified compound hidden deep in the woods. Armed with intel gathered from Jake, who had turned himself into Marcus in a desperate bid for survival, Marcus and his elite team moved with precision and purpose. Jake, now a broken man, had revealed everything he knew about the broker's operation, including the location of the compound and the identities of key players. But even with this information, Marcus knew the mission would be dangerous. The broker was a man who thrived on chaos, and he would not go down without a fight. As Marcus and his team breached the compound, they were met with a hail of gunfire, the air thick with smoke and the sound of shouting. It was a battle unlike any Marcus had faced before, a brutal, no-holds-barred fight for justice. Inside the compound, Marcus finally came face to face with the broker. The man was everything Marcus had imagined: cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless. But there was something else in his eyes, something Marcus hadn't expected: fear. The broker knew his empire was crumbling, and he was desperate to escape. In a final, desperate move, he tried to bargain with Marcus, offering him information about Harold's past in exchange for his freedom. But Marcus wasn't interested in deals. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to let the broker walk away. In a tense standoff, Marcus confronted the broker, demanding answers. What he learned would change everything. The broker revealed that Harold's past was far more complicated than Marcus had ever imagined. Years ago, Harold had been involved in a secret government program, one that had gone horribly wrong. The program had been shut down, but not before it had ruined countless lives. The broker had been one of those lives, and he had spent years plotting his revenge. Harold, he claimed, was the key to it all. Meanwhile, Harold and Frank had uncovered the truth about B. The letters had been sent by a man named Benjamin, a former colleague of Harold's from the government program. Benjamin had been presumed dead for decades, but he had been living in hiding, consumed by guilt and anger. He had orchestrated the mugging as a way to draw Harold out, to force him to confront the past they had both tried to forget. But as Harold and Frank tracked Benjamin down, they realized that he wasn't the villain they had thought him to be. Benjamin was a broken man, haunted by the same demons that had plagued Harold for years. In a heart-wrenching confrontation, Harold and Benjamin finally faced each other, their shared pain and regret laid bare. It was a moment of catharsis, a chance for both men to find closure after decades of silence. As the dust settled, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Marcus, having captured the broker, learned the full extent of his father's involvement in the government program. It was a revelation that shook him to his core, but it also gave him a new understanding of the man he had always admired. Harold, though flawed, had spent his life trying to make amends for the mistakes of his past. And Marcus, in his quest for justice, had come to see that the world wasn't as black and white as he had once believed. The broker, for all his evil, was a product of a system that had failed him, just as it had failed so many others. It was a sobering realization, one that left Marcus questioning the very nature of justice and redemption. In the end, the story came full circle. Harold, Marcus, and Jake found themselves standing at a crossroads, each of them forever changed by the events that had unfolded. Harold, having confronted his past, found a new sense of peace. He returned to his community determined to use his experiences to help others, to offer the guidance and support he had once given to his students. Marcus, though still committed to his duty, had gained a new perspective. He understood now that true justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about understanding, about finding a way to break the cycle of violence and despair. And Jake, who had once been lost, found a glimmer of hope. In turning himself in, he had taken the first step toward redemption, and though the road ahead would be long and difficult, he knew it was a road worth taking. But just when it seemed like the story had reached its conclusion, a final twist left everyone in awe. As Marcus was debriefing his team, he received a call from an unknown number. On the other end was a voice he hadn't heard in years: his mother. She had been presumed dead, but she had been living in hiding, protecting a secret that could change everything. The government program Harold had been involved in wasn't just a failed experiment. It was the key to a conspiracy that went all the way to the top. And now, with the broker in custody and the truth finally coming to light, Marcus realized that this was just the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. Together with his father, his mother, and even Jake, Marcus knew they could face whatever came next. As the screen fades to black, the audience is left with a powerful message that no matter how dark the past, there is always a chance for redemption. That the bonds of family, the strength of love, and the power of truth can overcome even the greatest of evils. This is a story that will stay with you long after the video ends, a story that challenges you to think, to feel, and to believe in the possibility of a better tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and remember, the fight for justice is never truly over. It's up to all of us to keep the flame alive.